Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm Jacqueline Lottin, and my study is there. Up there, I worked on a case study investigation of special needs inclusion policy implementation in 3 Abu Dhabi primary schools in the UAE. Apologies due to my situation, I cannot stand up for up to 30 minutes. I hope you don't mind me sitting down. Okay. Before I go to the introduction, just a bit of background why I decided to choose this topic. I have worked in the UK and here on inclusion and special needs education. It's a topic I'm very passionate about. I believe that every child can learn, and as educators, we should always make sure we push every single child we come into contact with to help them to get the best that they can be. So with that background, I decided to explore this topic in a pretty virgin area here in the UAE, where when I arrived 7 years ago, many people did not know in our schools, in our aim, what inclusive education was all about. It was quite new for them. So in my study, I started off with looking at the history of education in the UAE, from being a nomadic country to the great strides that the government has done to pursue, to promote education in this country, which has been amazing. Starting from where the first schools took cue from other Arab states like Kuwait and Jordan. That is where the education, the model that they were using in this country started, right through to 1985, when the Ministry of Education developed its own curriculum for the UAE. And we have Ghana in 95, GAD in 2004. Those studies have been done by other researchers. So I had to go into the research, as limited as it is. I had to search to see what has been done on education, inclusive education in the UAE. And I was able to get some. Now, so moving on from that stage where education was run by the ministry, it was segregated, through to where we are today, where inclusion is beginning to happen in the schools. Some of the background, all of this has come about because the UAE decided to align with the United Nations conventions on the rights of people to an equitable education. So the UAE signed up to that, and because they signed up to that, they had a duty of compliance. They had to make sure that their schools were being inclusive. Their schools were taking out the barriers to make education available to every child. So the Salamanca Convention of '94 was one of the key conferences that took place that really spelled out the whole idea, where inclusion was born. It spelled out the whole idea that children, irrespective of their disability, whether the disability is physical, intellectual, social, or emotional, should be taught in the same classroom as able-bodied children, as children who do not have disabilities. So, because the UAE decided to adopt the UN Convention, Federal Law number 23 came into being, and this law specifically protected the rights and guaranteed equitable education for all students, including those with disabilities. And Hassan explained that very well in his studies. ADEC, Abu Dhabi Education Council, where I work, where I did my research on, decided to respond to this federal law and came up with the Special Educational Needs Policy Handbook. This was boosted by the Ministry of Education, already had the School for All handbook, which aligned to the UN and Salamanca Convention. So Abu Dhabi Education decided to respond to that. As you all know, in the UAE, each area has its own education authority. And Abu Dhabi has its own authority, as well as Dubai and the other emirates. So each emirate has its own education authority, but the Ministry of Education oversees everything, although it's a bit different now. Okay, so moving on, the purpose for my work, before we get to that, so when ADEC responded to the ministry's School for All initiative, this was very important because although the country is an Islamic country steeped in Islamic cultures, it was important that what the convention was saying about caring for your neighbor, irrespective of their disabilities, that was brought into law. And because that has been brought into law, it is not just based on Islamic teachings. The schools were now able, or the education authorities were now able to do this because they had leverage. They had been given leverage to make sure that schools are being inclusive. Schools are taking every child and not turning them away. So that is important to take note. So the purpose of my work was, in assessing the school's execution of the policy, I had 5 aims. I wanted to explore policy application. Abu Dhabi Education Council had a special needs policy. How is that being applied in the schools? I wanted to examine how this policy supports the children with special needs in those schools. I wanted to also find out staff experiences. How do the staff describe their implementation of that policy? Also evaluate the impact of the policy on practice. How has that policy now, which gives them the right to educate the child to the best of their ability, how is that working in practice? What's actually going on? And then finally attend to any gaps. So in doing the first 4, if there were any gaps as I went into the schools to find out what was going on the ground, what can we do to reduce the gap between... So that was the rationale. So the rationale for my study is the reason why we have the gap. So we had a research problem that I found out very quickly that there was a big disparity between policy and practice. A very robust policy, but not quite what was happening on the ground. And this was the 5th year. I started doing the work in the 5th year of policy implementation. That policy had been in existence for 5 years and it had not been reviewed. So it sort of was the right time to look at how this policy is actually being applied on the ground. So this led to my main guiding question. To what extent is ADEC's policy implemented in practice? And what can be done to improve its implementation to support inclusive education in schools in Abu Dhabi? It was as I carried on with the work, with the study, and began doing data collection, I realized that following the first Bowie doctoral conference, where it was like a testing ground for some of us on what we were trying to work on, I found that I had to break the main guiding question to 2 separate research questions so I can go deeper and understand to get the answers that I was looking for. So the 2 research questions I came up with was, how do teachers and administrators understand and describe the practice of inclusion, and what improvements do teachers want to be able to foster effective inclusion? So what do they want in the schools to support them be more inclusive teachers? To answer the 2 research questions, I had to look at 4 key areas in the schools where that is where I would see the practice, and from that I will be able to establish whether inclusion is actually happening or not. So I looked at, the 4 key areas were curriculum, accessibility, assessment, and in-service professional development. So to explain that very quickly, the curriculum, obviously, I had to look at the Abu Dhabi school model, which was our curriculum at the time. How does the curriculum support the teachers in being inclusive? The curriculum was very robust. It was, Abu Dhabi school model is an open curriculum. It's a 21st century curriculum that encourages interactive learning. And so I had to look at how this curriculum is supporting the teachers to do this. Accessibility has all got to do with what is there to help the child with disabilities access learning. Are there physical barriers? So do we have ramps, for example, in the school? Do we have disabled toilets? So what are the physical, what has the school done to physically help? What modifications have been done, or adaptations, to physically help children access learning? So that has got to do with accessibility. It's also got to do with the feelings, how people feel towards disability. What are the attitudes? So are the attitudes positive? If the teachers are positive, that helps in accessibility. That has got to do with accessibility. Positive attitudes, do they want to support these children? Do they want them in the room? Assessment, how is assessment done to involve every child? Do we have modifications to the tests that the children are given? Are the children tested at the beginning of the school year? Is there a diagnosis and an intervention plan put in place so that every child can meet their target and improve? And lastly, looking through professional development. This is fundamental to inclusion working. Teachers have got to be continuously trained and updated on the latest good practices around them. What are the best practice methods? Teachers have, in-service teachers need to be continuously trained. So one of the things I was looking at is how are schools doing this? Now, my research was in 3 schools, as I put at the beginning, 3 schools in the 3 regions of Abu Dhabi. They were primary schools, 3 primary schools, because I chose primary schools because the kids are still at that young age, but have been in the system for a good while. It's not at the beginning in kindergarten. They would have been in the education system where if inclusive practices were taking place, they would have got some of that. It would have hit the children by that time. So I was looking at primary schools with teachers who have longevity. So the teachers who have been working for ADEC from the time when the policy was in place. So those teachers would have had the opportunity to use that policy in their classroom. So it was important to look at schools that had that longevity. Research problem. Now, the research problem, as I said before, is that there was a gap between policy and practice, and that brought into play what I was trying to do. The significance of the study for me was that it was a topical issue. Inclusion is a buzzword in educational circles now. It's all about inclusion. What is inclusion? There are so many different views. Those who are for inclusion, those who believe in inclusion, that inclusion can help every child make progress, those who do not really believe in inclusion. So, the significance was I was working on a topic that globally is very, very on the front of educational circles. I was evaluating that policy for the first time since its inception. So it was in the 5th or 6th year of its operation. It was important to recognize the stakeholders, those who were involved in driving forward inclusion in the schools. So from ADEC headquarters, from the headquarters in ADEC who were responsible for special needs, through to the schools, the principal, the students, the special needs teacher, and parents, the stakeholders who were involved. It was important to find out from them what was going on, what their views were, and in so doing, close the gap. In so doing, close the gap between policy and practice if there was a gap. So this, I just made this table to make it quick and easy. My literature review was extensive outside the UAE because a lot of studies are being done. Within the UAE, there is some studies done, but limited. Not very many. Professor Imangad, my supervisor, has done a lot of studies here with Argano and a few people I have quoted who have studied what actually is happening in schools. Is inclusion actually happening in the schools? But These were the two theoretical frameworks I worked on, I based my studies on. We had two models of disability at the time. The medical model was the first model that had been on for ages, as early as in the 30s. So the medical model of disability was being used in the schools. And this model emphasized, well, it was clinical in nature, as the term medical means. So the schools were looking at the child's disability from the illness that they have. So clinical interventions were being done. There was segregation. Students were kept apart. So students with disabilities were not in the same classroom as their counterparts at the time. People with disabilities were seen as victims of a tragedy, that something really bad. They had done something very bad in this life or in the afterlife, and that is why they are disabled. And they were used, there was a lot of derogatory terms, even here in the UAE. For example, Down syndrome people were called Mongols. You know, they were using stupid, useless names, really nasty names to describe people with disabilities. That was how the medical model, with those key researchers, Birds, Cornell, Critic, how they all were viewing disability. Now, but because of a lot of discussions and debates around disability, there was a move to leave this negativity about disability behind. And that is how the social model, constructivist model came in, which is what my study is based on. Now, the social model was a complete opposite to the medical model, because the social model emphasized, being social, emphasized learning as a social activity. So kids have to come together irrespective of their condition. There was no segregation. The social model propounded for kids to work in the same school. So we don't have a special school separate from a normal school. They were all in the same school, although it still started with segregation, where the disabled children were still kept in another classroom from the mainstream classroom, from the classroom with students without disabilities. But there was no segregation. There was an improvement that we did not have exclusive schools. The kids could all be in the same place. It conformed to the morality of inclusion, where equal rights, equal opportunity given to every child. Resources were put into place to support the children where they needed support. So this is where my study came in, and people like Oliver in 1992, there were strong proponents to the social model of disability, which no longer viewed disability as a tragedy. They saw disability as caused, so that society was putting a blame on these children instead of society was putting barriers for them because they were tagging them as disabled. So they needed to look at the opposite situation, where society takes responsibility and everyone in the school should take responsibility for the child's education. It was a collaborative action from anyone. So that was the theoretical framework that my study was based on, the social model of disability. And it is this social model that was directly highlighted at the Salamanca Convention and the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. My research design was driven by my topic. Now, it was a qualitative study, and using collective case study method from the hermeneutic traditions. Now, I decided to use qualitative study because qualitative study, from my research, doing a lot of literature reviews that I was reading, qualitative studies are the most common that have been used in disability studies around the world. Qualitative because it will provide insights into the participants. I will be able to understand the school participants more. It is people-centered. And I will be able to enter the world of the schools and get first-hand knowledge, close proximity, working with the teachers and people in the schools. So that gave credence to me, justified me using a qualitative study. Collective case study because I used 3 different schools in 3 different areas in Abu Dhabi, so data was varied. I was able to get it gives it that qualitative edge to get rich data from multiple sources. That is why I used a collective case study method, so I can be able to go deep into it. I was not out to generalize, to make generalizations for schools across the UAE. I just wanted to get some balance and variety, to know what is happening in the schools and learn from that. So the two research questions which I read before, how do teachers and administrators understand disability and what recommendations to improve it. These two research questions guided the design and the use of the tool of evaluation. Now I used the index of inclusion. The index of inclusion is a very popular tool in inclusive studies because it's very flexible, it's very adaptable, it helps you to look at every single facet within a school and see whether inclusion is happening there. It was created by Booth and Engsko in 2000 and tested in Bristol for the first time. And this was where our schools were at the time. The index would help me look at different aspects in the school and see where inclusion was happening. So it was ideal for me to use in the situation where I was. The methodology was also guided by my research questions. Because I wanted to find out in depth what was happening in the schools, I decided to use the three most common qualitative methods of observations, semi-structured interviews, and document analysis. Observations because I will be able to see firsthand, inside and outside the classroom, how the teachers are interacting with the children, how management is interacting to promote inclusion. Observations will also help me see, hear different perspectives of what is going on in the schools. Semi-structured interviews gave another edge in that I will be able to look at not just the answers that they gave me, but facial gestures. All of that makes you understand, go deeper and understand the situation that we were into. And together with the observations, I can see very clearly how kids are coping in an inclusive school or not. Document analysis was important to see the official documents, so the policy document, the School for All document from Ministry of Education, as well as school documents to do with SEN, so for special needs, so things like IEP, the individual education plans. What are the targets that are being used to support the children in the schools? So the different school documents, attendance records, for example, how do these all support an inclusive environment in the schools? I hope I'm not speaking too fast.
Over time, so we might do.
So then the sampling was purposive because I needed to look at representativeness. So where I needed to look at the schools where this inclusion would happen. It's actually happening for me to be able to get the answers I was looking for. So I interviewed the head of SEN in ADEC. I had 10 teachers, 15 students, 3 principals, 3 therapists, and 3 social workers who were part of my sample. And to mention here that I piloted the research instruments just to make sure to fine-tune them. And all through this, I was conscious of ethical considerations in order to avoid bias. So my research methods of using 3 types of methodology to triangulate the data helped me to minimize the bias that I could experience. Now, I have copies of this. This is like a summary of my homework. If anyone is interested, the copies are on the table there. So what it basically is on. So basically, what it's saying here is that I decided to take research question 1 and research question 2. It was important to triangulate the data to get the information I wanted. So I took the first research question, mapped it against the 3 research methods, and then looked at the 4 key areas in the school where I think I will be able to describe the practices that were happening on the ground. So the Q1s are all the questions that I asked them in the semi-structured interviews, for example, and these questions were aligned to the index for inclusion. The indicators of the index for inclusion are aligned, the questions, the semi-structured interview questions to that, so that I can get the answers that I wanted. So I had this table which explains how the 4 key areas aligned to the research methods. So same thing I did with research question 2, what recommendations can be made. In looking at the recommendations to improve inclusion, I looked at the 3 key parts of the index for inclusion. Inclusive cultures, what is the culture in the school? Inclusive policies, what policies are in place to support the school to promote inclusion? And inclusive practices, what is actually happening on the ground? So I had to triangulate that information to get the data I wanted. So findings. My findings were in like 3 different blocks. So the first bit had to do with the document analysis, where I used content analysis, because as research showed, content analysis, I will be able to go deep into the documents that were available, read them, make notes on the margin. So I followed the steps for content analysis to be able to get the information that I wanted, make notes on the margin, create a list, categorize the information, and compare and contrast to be able to come up with the themes. So, the findings were that the ADEPT policy gave schools leverage and entitlement to engage, to make sure that teachers are doing what they have to do, the principals are using inclusion, the parents demanding that their children should stay in that school and not be sent away that they have disabilities. The handbook also had admission, all the schools, every child who came to the school was admitted, was not turned away. There was high parental engagement. So the handbook is very robust, but it is not put in practice. So my findings were that the policy handbook was still at the implementation stage in the schools. The schools were still beginning to get on board with inclusion. There is still a big dichotomy between ADEC and the Ministry of Social Affairs, who were the ones who handled disability before, but they do not have an educational agenda like ADEC schools have. So there is still that dichotomy where what the children would benefit. There was no capacity for modified curriculum in the school, so I didn't find that. There was none of that. And then looking at research question 1 specifically, the findings were that the curriculum was very robust, as I said before. ADEC's Abu Dhabi school model was very outcome-based curriculum with a set of activities that students go through and to get the learning outcomes. It emphasized a rich environment. I found that in all the schools. But in spite of that, the teachers were very stressed out because they did not get a lot of support. There was no differentiation. There was no modification and very limited classroom assistance in the schools to support those very needy students for the teachers. Accessibility, one key thing I found with accessibility was co-teaching, which was in practice in one school, and it made a big difference to the children who had disabilities when there were 2 teachers in the classroom, so one was able to work with a group of disabled children and help them make progress. But we had problems. I found out that there were problems of referrals. Students were not being referred as they should on time, and there was problem with resourcing, lack of resources. The schools that had resources, teachers did not know how to use it because they were not trained. There was a great need for professional development because teachers needed the skills and knowledge to be able to manage disability. As research question 2, in reference to that, I found 7 things of inclusive culture in the schools. They were very welcoming, Islamic values, but in spite of that, people were still not sure whether they believed in inclusion. There was a lack of SEL, enough special needs teachers to support in the schools. Poor communication between the school and the parents, poor communication between leadership and the teachers on how to support the students. So the culture was still at the beginning stage. Inclusive policies, all the schools had safe buildings because ADEC has all new school buildings in most of our schools. So they were made safe for the children, but as there was limited identification and big problems with behavior. That was the biggest problem for the children who had special needs in my group. And inclusive practices, as I said before, were still at the beginning stages. Limited resources and modification and identification were not really being done. Recommendations. what I felt the recommendations coming from the findings was that we need increased communication between ADEC and the schools, because many of the schools did not even know that the policy existed. So that was a big stumbling block, which was surprising to find. Policy awareness in the schools, in-service training, more shortage of SEN teachers needs to be addressed. Community awareness programs where they let the community, they will be more accepting of these children and inclusive practices if they knew what to do. And more PD, assistive technology is needed in the schools. Like in one school, there was a child with serious visual problems. He was going blind, and they were still waiting for a Braille teacher to come, so he couldn't access the content. And those are my references. And on a closing note, I believe that for final thoughts, the study was useful in that it carried on with the current debates in the field for people to be aware. Now, but the way the debate in inclusive education is moving towards more policy. In making policy, policymakers must speak to parents and to the children who are involved for policy to be effective. For it to work in the schools, they need to talk to each other more, to engage the parents and the students, and they need to reduce remediation, because when you start looking at intervention strategies, you are pinpointing the weaknesses, the disability of the child. Look at other ways to respond with equity and respect to disability. And I'm hoping that working in ADEC, my study is not going to sit on a shelf and gather dust. I will be able to, I am in a position where I can influence action research in the field on inclusive studies. Sorry for going over, thank you very much.